My today's guest is Siegfried Herzog from Compliance Labs Liechtenstein. And the big topic for today is compliance, not only in the blockchain world, but also with traditional intermediaries. We will also compare what is different when it comes to compliance with intermediaries, traditional intermediaries like banks or trust officers, and blockchain service providers. We will talk about his experience being a compliance officer with one of the biggest exchanges, and we will talk about topics like the travel rule and the future of compliance and blockchain. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Welcome to Coffee from the Block from the House of Blockchain in Liechtenstein. My today's guest is Dr. Siegfried Herzog. He's the managing partner of Compliance Labs Liechtenstein. Welcome.
Hello, Thomas. Thank you for having me here.
Siegfried, you're now managing partner of a compliance firm here in Liechtenstein, advising a lot of crypto blockchain companies. But what did your career look like before you founded Compliance Labs Liechtenstein?
Actually, that is a long story to tell, but I will keep it as short as possible. I started as a lawyer, and when I figured out that there is more than litigation, I was driven into finance in Liechtenstein. And since there was no post for a, I would say, relationship manager, I was asked to become a compliance officer, which was back then in 2011 a quite new function, and nobody was.
That was at the larger law firm, right?
Yes, that's true. It was like a bigger finance group actually. So it consisted of a bank, a trust office, and certain other financial services were provided. And since then, or back then, the compliance function was really known for banks, but not so much for trust offices. And it developed very, very fast, and taking this knowledge into account, or based on that knowledge that I was able to collect over the past years, I had the idea to really get self-employed and offer my services based on the experience I made.
And I had Matthias Lange already here. He's a tax consultant, and I talked to Matthias in 2016, and I told him, Matthias, taxes is something which I really have no clue about, right, in the end. I mean, our tax regime is quite easy in Liechtenstein. And the same is actually true for compliance, right? Compliance is such an area where it's so huge at the moment, right? And it developed so fast that you have to focus on a daily basis, I think, to being able to advise in that area. So what is Compliance Labs offering? Like, what are your clients asking you to do or help them with?
Exactly. You already outlined the most important development of compliance. So we all see a flood of laws that are imposed on a daily basis, which means that we saw really people focusing on certain areas, and it's absolutely the same in the compliance sector, where you're not able to really provide everything out of one hand at the end of the day, but you need to have different experts for different fields, like tax regulation, like tax reporting issues, really KYC issues, all the documentation, keeping files accurate and up to date. And it is really like a special and exclusive area of the financial services, and that offered me the opportunity to really get a team in place that would be able to offer the services needed not only for the traditional finance, but also for certain areas in the tax reporting sector, also for crypto related entities that are also drawn into the same system. So what we are actually offering is compliance as a wholesaler, I'd say, but being able to provide the different experts for the different fields.
So you're the one-stop shop for compliance.
Yes,
if I'm an
true.
intermediary in Liechtenstein, a traditional one, and just want to have traditional compliance, I can approach you. Or if I'm a company in the new technology world, let's call it blockchain, I can also approach you. And
Correct.
What are you doing? Like helping me with drafting policies, or implementing them, or educating my staff, or all of that, or?
Yes, that's all certain, or the services you mentioned are all included in our offering. It depends on financial counterparty we are dealing with. So if we set up a new compliance framework for a new financial intermediary, we really start off in drafting the policies, helping with establishing the processes, also searching and looking for the right software that you need to have in place, but also training of staff. And then, of course, the biggest task, helping with the doing, the operational. Because if there is something, and I tried to outline it back in 2011, compliance was not that fancy. It was more or less a job that needed to be done, but it was not too, being a lawyer and offering law services to a client is really high level, and everybody is admiring you for your knowledge. And back then, compliance was like, okay, we don't know how to deal with that. Today, it is completely different. You don't find the experts because there aren't too much experts in the compliance field. So the field is developing, and we need to educate the people for the market.
Yeah, the most advice, that's what we see as well, not only in the blockchain space, but also in the traditional world, is actually tax, legal, and compliance. Like these are the three main areas. So you started, as you said, with the traditional world, so to speak, banks, yes, intermediaries, trust offices, and help them with complying with all of the compliance rules we have in place. And this is a very, very, also very fast-paced world. At least that's my impression, every second month there's a new regulation entering into force, or is announced new guidelines from whatever regulatory body you can imagine. There are a lot of areas where you have to be up to date and up to speed, and that's something I think which makes a lot of sense if you focus as a consultancy firm to advise in that area, to make it as more efficient as somehow possible, also for your clients, that they don't have to analyze all of these new developments. And you also were the chief compliance officer of a major exchange for quite a time. And so you had experience, or you have experience with helping blockchain companies with large volumes of transactions, as well with the compliance framework. Tell us a little bit more about that experience.
Absolutely, I'm happy to do so. I think the biggest difference from a traditional finance perspective, and I would call it new technologies or finance 2.0, or you name it as you wish. The biggest difference is really the speed and the volume of transactions. So to start with the beginning, within the financial system, the traditional finance world, we had a certain pace that got faster and faster, but it was at a certain point of time there was a limit. If you do physical onboarding, you're only able to onboard a certain amount of people.
Physical onboarding mean I sign papers,
yes,
show up in person,
you show up in person.
They will check my
Correct,
ID.
Correct. Okay. That there is a limit. But if you transfer that world into a digital sphere where everybody would be able to sign on or to onboard over digital channels, I mean that is the biggest change in systems, meaning that everybody can do onboarding from home.
I did it with one of the challenger banks. It was some years ago already, and I was sitting actually in Prague, I think. I was sitting in Prague and waiting for my wife. And I onboarded completely, like only with my phone. I did a picture of my ID, and then I had a video call, and I was onboarded within 5 minutes. It was perfect in comparison to the experience you have in the traditional world, right?
Absolutely, and I already see you smiling, and that is the important development. So people feel comfortable in not having like all these pre-work to get the appointments with the bank, to show up, to bring their passports with them, or it's simple as that. People show up in front of the bank and only have their driver's license with them, and the bank is simply saying, we don't accept driver's licenses. We want to have a copy of your passport.
Yeah, if you sit at home in your couch and you have your driver license and then the system tells you, yeah, not accepted, you have to get your ID. I mean, then you go to your locker and get your ID, right?
It's way easier. And what happened on the other side, and that is actually what happened to compliance, is that people were easily accessing financial services. And it got more and more attractive to onboard with different service providers for different services they offer. So what happened is that in terms of onboarding and KYC mechanisms and all the compliance
KYC
stuff,
is know your customer.
Yes.
So
Thank
that's,
you. Yeah.
That's
so it's
the
identifying the natural person or the legal person. You had to really work off or work through the onboardings that are listed in your backend. And
onboardings is this like 60-page document I get if I want to open up a bank account.
Yes,
I'm over-exaggerating a little bit, but it's a lot of paperwork.
I would absolutely love to confirm 60 pages. Actually, I saw one with 130 pages.
Okay.
Which already gives you an understanding of how complicated the traditional world got and where the new world is heading to. That is also something I really need to stress. Since every technology needs some time to be implemented and to get acceptance on the market and to be accepted by the authorities, it is developing. And that's actually what we see in the compliance world, in the digital compliance world as well. So you have these big, huge volumes of onboardings you need to go through. You need to ensure that all the security measurements have been taken. You need to have an understanding of the software and the technical tools that are used are in line with the law. So it is basically not only an understanding of the regulation, but also an understanding of the business in terms of understanding the tools that are used and getting this approach that should be, or where the idea at least was that the new technologies would be way faster and way easier, should not end up in being more complicated than the traditional one.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is something what we discussed so far, which is not different if you use, or if you're a blockchain service provider or you're a traditional intermediary. I mean, if you have to onboard your clients now, like as I said, challenger banks are doing that process fully digitally. You can do that from home. There was actually an interesting thing that intermediaries are now using these technologies to onboard their clients. And Dr. Otto Frommelt from the National Road Office told me that they are working on a blockchain solution that you're able to not only buy your car from home, but you get your car insured and you get it registered with the National Road Office actually at your server in front of your TV, right? But so what is different when you speak about like service providers in the blockchain space and traditional intermediaries? I think the onboarding is quite the same. I mean, you have to have video ID, you have to show your ID, you have to get recognized, and that's a KYC part, right? But what is different? Is it transaction monitoring or?
No, I think the biggest difference is really, first of all, and that is the current problem, the acceptance of new technologies. What really fell away, or what is really disappearing, is the personal contact with your client. So the understanding of the authority, and I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, it's always about the acceptance with the authorities. The risk that occurs is that you are not meeting the client in person, and you could be tricked by technical means. So, for example, using deepfake and pretending you're a person you're not.
Deepfake is a very interesting way of faking your identity, actually. I mean, you need some pictures from social media, I think it's 3, and then in the end, you are able to real-time have your face video rendered, and you can use that video rendered image, for example, when you onboard with an intermediary and fake your identity. That's actually quite, it's fascinating to see from a technological point of view what is possible, but that is, as you said, that's the fear of regulators, that if you use these technology and you don't meet the client in person anymore, you just use the technology, that these technologies are used to get onboarded with clients or with intermediaries without being really that identity. That is a threat for sure, but there is also, I think, deepfake, the limitations at the moment for everybody's use is that if you do like this in front of the face, it's not that easy to fake that, because that's very hard to fake. Yes. But that's one thing, and I think and that's all covered by this biometric onboarding. I think our Financial Market Authority issued guidelines if you want to use within your onboarding some of these technologies. They defined some false acceptance rate from a biometric point of view. So these technologies are used, and for sure there are challenges, right? But this is also still the same. I mean, if we have, let's say, and we talked about that as well in other talks about the electronic identity issued by a government, right? Or there are ways of how you actually identify yourself with the use of blockchain technology. But within your work, I mean, if you advise, let's say, a traditional financial intermediary with a lot of clients, and now you talked about your experience with being the compliance officer in a blockchain company. What is really, like, do they use the same tools? Is it the same tools we have that you've just check all of your clients, or are they using different tools? I mean, I know that there are like these huge service providers which you blockchain forensics and blockchain analytics. Is it different, or?
No, absolutely. You already touched the point. I would say the biggest difference is really the transformation from a personal contact-based and also mostly paper-based day-to-day work to a fully digitized system, which means that, of course, if we use the blockchain within the new financial services, we have like a transactional register that goes back to transaction 0 or 1. And actually what has been developed by chain analyzers, for example, to name the most famous one and possibly the most powerful one, you will be able, or over the past years it has become more and more powerful, and we see it as of today that you are able to trace back transactions as to the beginning. So what is missing at the moment is to bring that transaction hashes or that transaction addresses in line with identities. And if you do that, I'm already trying to bring the travel rule as an instrument into our discussion. You will be able to really trace back any transaction over any individual, and that, if you imagine that is like really putting the transactions in a glassy or transparent manner.
I mean, what you're saying is, yes, some blockchains are fully transparent, not every blockchain, but you actually have full transparency, and every transaction can be looked up, right? But you don't have names behind addresses. So if I transfer you, let's say, if I transfer you 0.1 Bitcoin, I will transfer it to your address and not to your bank account and name, and it's not directly linked to anyone. So the question now is, because everything is fully publicly available, this information, If you do analysis, you can actually check every transaction from every address to every address. That is easy to, I mean, it's not, but it's possible from a technological point of view, and these service providers are doing that. The challenge comes when you try to link this information, the address, to the individual. And you have one, how that is actually done at the moment is intermediaries, they have to build that link between individuals and addresses. And there are others, you briefly touched on the travel rule, which has to be implemented by the states, and actually is already implemented in Liechtenstein since June last year, 2021, where you then, not only the service providers, but like the service providers have to not only identify their own clients, but even if they transfer to an address they don't know, they have to check that in really basic terms. Which brings me to one big picture, right? We have now a technology which is able to allow like individuals to transfer value without having any intermediaries in place. And you have an industry which is developing, which provide products and services based on that technology. And we have the traditional world of compliance where you have to file 80 pages or 120 pages to get onboarded, which is like the same. In Liechtenstein, at least, the level of compliance is the same, right? If you are onboarding with a bank, it's the same compliance you have to fulfill when it comes to onboarding as it is with intermediary servicing clients in the blockchain space. But and there are technologies which makes that easier. You can video onboard. The question is for me then, like, where is my privacy ending up? Because I don't, to be very honest, wherever I am, I mean, even if you have nothing to hide, right? I have to get onboarded with all of these intermediaries. I have to get onboarded with my blockchain service provider. I have to get onboarded with bank A, with bank B. I have to get onboarded with my fiduciary. I have to get onboarded. Like everybody is asking me for that 80 to 120 pages. And my impression, just as a user, I'm not a compliance expert. I don't know if this really serves the purpose of like avoiding money laundering and avoiding financing of terrorism. Because they literally want to know everything about myself, my source of funds, my source of wealth, what do I like have my income in person, also from my company, literally everything. And I don't know if that's needed. And in the future, if we have a look at how this would actually develop, you said people are getting very transparent with every transaction because everything is more and more digitalized, right? So we have all of our transactions in a digital way, and we will see, and that's I think that is pretty clear. We already pay like really small amounts with our credit cards, and if we use blockchain technology to pay, for example, you will end up in the same situation that if you want to analyze one's behaviors, it's pretty easy. So I have really privacy concerns because you have to imagine also from a cybersecurity perspective, all of these intermediaries, they have to safeguard my data. They have passport copies, they have utility bills, they have a lot of information about myself. And it's not the first time where we see this information in Telegram groups of like 40,000 or 100,000 people. What's your perspective on that? Where is compliance, not only in the blockchain world, but also in the traditional intermediary world heading? And do we have to be afraid of losing our privacy?
That's, I would say, one of the biggest and most interesting questions at the moment, not only from a compliance perspective, but in general. Because what we see, and it's all about transformation, or as others say, disruption of the financial sector and the technologies, we see that everything is getting more and more digital. At the end of the day, you already touched the base there. The question is, who is allowed to see what data and how is the data protected before being exchanged, and what are like the barriers for exchange of data? And I think by the blockchain developments or the blockchain-based services that were developed, the speed of development was like 100 times faster than before. And what we see is not only that the digital channels are developing very fast, but also the traditional finance world is trying to keep up with the speed, or at least to catch the developments of the digital sector, which means that also in the financial world, the traditional financial world, digitalization and digital processes are implemented on a day-by-day basis, and they get more and more digital. So meaning digital onboarding is for the traditional finance sector a very big topic. And you see not only banks, but also financial intermediaries jumping into digital onboarding and also getting that data in digital. And I mean, what I really want to disclose is where the developments come from. So we see all the collection of the KYC, the know your customer data, and know your beneficial owner of the assets you are preserving for your clients is coming from a time 1970s to 2000. And it is a really strong European development. That is also something I need to admit. And looking back in history, I have the feeling that the Swedish system that was developed, like very transparent, your neighbor could have accessed the database in like 20 years ago already, where he saw how much you're earning, how many cars you have, how many properties you have. And actually, I think the European Union, by developing stronger anti-money laundering rules and also anti-tax fraud rules, was driven by that idea to make it more and more transparent, because it's easy to investigate on such data. And of course, coming back to your question, that is combined with a certain loss of privacy. That is very logic. If you have more and more transparency in the system, because you think as an authority or as a regulator that by pushing that transparency you prevent more and more tax fraud or money laundering, you push the people into a very transparent and open world in terms of that everybody would have a certain ability to access data.
Yeah, and that's also endangering these people, because
that is a big danger.
Because from a criminal perspective, that's actually the fear quite a lot of our peers have, that if people would know what they really like, what's their wealth, right? They will be in more risk of getting even of getting kidnapped and stuff like that, right? So yes. they really have serious security concerns. And I think we really have to stress out that nobody wants to support money laundering and financing of terrorism, and like nobody really wants that. That's for sure. And we have to make as much as possible to prevent that, right? But I don't know if it's worth paying that price, right? To lose completely your privacy just because we don't think of using other solutions to the same problem. And I think now it's the time to also use blockchain and analyze blockchain, because I think with blockchain, you would be able to serve the purpose, which we I think can agree on has to be addressed. AML, CFT for sure, as I said. But on the other hand, keeping the privacy of the users and the individuals. And I think Europe is especially putting a lot of efforts in the GDPR, right, in the data protection. And I think we shouldn't forget about that when we think about compliance.
Yes, the problem with that is that the GDPR allows the transaction of data based on a law, which means that the system is driving itself ad absurdum, because I always have like a law on know your customer and transaction monitoring duties within the law, and would be obliged to transfer that data between counterparty 1 and counterparty 2. So the really important thing, and you already mentioned that, is we need to develop systems that are allowing the enforcement of law, but still prevent the data from being public. And what we see with the travel rule, and that is really something that is causing pain for me, is that there is not a global strategy in place. It was just dropped by the FATF because they saw back in history, to understand where it comes from. We had the terrible terrorist attacks in at 9/11, and what happened then was that the FATF said, okay, we need to understand which transaction was issued by whom and who was the recipient. And the same system, the FATF now said, understandably, needs to be applied for the virtual asset regime. Absolutely agree. But before imposing the law, there should have been like a strategy how to put that in place, because what happens now is smaller states that are to a certain amount reliant on financial services impose the law because they don't think about the consequences. Bigger states that are not too much reliant on or relying on financial services are not deeming it as important as the other ones who have like a financial sector in place. And what happens is that you don't have a level playing field anymore, and you get these like jurisdiction hopping and how do you call that?
The race to the bottom, or really jurisdiction hopping. You search for the jurisdiction which serves you the most, or where you have like the least or the most regulation in place, depending on your preferences.
Correct, and that is also not in line with the idea of the FATF, and that also shows why compliance becomes such a big topic, because it is always the same in terms of enforcement and the fight against money laundering, crime, tax fraud, whatever. The authority is always one step behind. The criminal and the intelligent criminals are always like one step in front, and the system is always like reacting. And what we do is we are not smart enough to use the new opportunities in terms of making it or changing the developments to our needs and using that for our system, but in a way that the clients are not completely transparent. Nobody wants it at the end of the day.
So I'm pretty sure that people are working on that to find new solutions, and it's more than understandable that if something already worked in another area and where you were able to fulfill your needs, you think of that solution the first. But I think now it's time to rethink that strategy and to have a new regulatory approach also when it comes to blockchain, to compliance, and not only for the supervisory part and civil law, as we already have it here in Liechtenstein. My final question is always, what is your favorite coffee, Siegfried?
The coffee from the block, to be honest, because there is nobody like Thomas that is investigating so much on and educating himself so much on coffee and roasting coffee and brewing coffee. So I always enjoyed coming.
I mean, there are for sure people who have way more understanding about coffee than I do, but as you are with your Compliance Lab Liechtenstein also a tenant of the House of Blockchain, it's rather easy for you to stop by and have a coffee, and that's much appreciated. And thank you very much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to our next stop. I think we would have like the topics for another 3 hours of discussions, even like, for example, the travel rule is a topic which we could step into way more. But thank you very much again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thanks for the interview.